Hi everybody, and welcome to video number 11. And this is the final video, ladies and gentlemen, in the first part of our course on the American West. And the first part was looking at the early settlement of the American West, 1835 to 1862. Now this video, video number 11, is about law and order. You see there, I am the sheriff. Do not mess with me, because I am the sheriff. Law and order, or should that really be named lawless and disorder? Because in the American West, in this first part of the course, ladies and gentlemen, law and order was a difficult problem, as hopefully we'll see in this video. Now, in a way, it links a bit to video number 8, where we looked at the gold miners. Some of the problems were very, very similar. Have a look back to video number 8 if you've forgotten some of those. So, the American West. It wasn't totally lawless, no, as we'll see, but there were significant problems. Now, what problems were there for the sheriff? Well, here's some. Number 1, geography. The size of the place, the size of the area that needed to be policed. It was very, very difficult to police it effectively because of the size. And that's linked to point number 2. There just were not enough law enforcement officers, what they called the sheriffs and the marshals. Today we would call them the police. So, a huge area and not enough people to cover that area. Now, some of the people who were the sheriffs, there's a little bit of a problem coming, ladies and gentlemen. And it's to do with money, the old Yankee dollar. It's to do with money. The job of a sheriff was not necessarily a well-paid one. Therefore, some sheriffs could be bribed. Some sheriffs would be corrupt and they wouldn't uphold the law. That could be a problem. We'll have a look at an example later in this video. Another problem is sheriffs were often very, very strong and brave men, often very good with a gun because they needed to be. So yes, they were good with a gun, but often they were not so good with the actual law itself. Sometimes bad decisions were made. They were not trained judges. Sometimes their bad decisions led to a bad feeling, anger, resentment, a thirst for revenge, which could lead to more problems. So often the sheriff, by his actions, did not bring peace to the situation. Sometimes they made things worse. And the final problem. Just consider the sorts of people who've moved to the American West. Many of them moved, ladies and gentlemen, because they wanted freedom, they wanted independence. They were moving to get away from government. Well, how would they feel if when they've moved, they see that the federal government is following and the federal government is getting involved in law and order? Would they be supportive? I'll leave you to think about that one. So, we've identified that there were quite a few problems to establishing a successful and effective system of law and order in the American West, particularly in the earlier period up to 1862, this part of the course. So let's have a look. I just mentioned there the federal government, and they did get involved, but certain steps had to be followed. First of all, an area of land, often very, very big, remember, would be called a territory. Now, territory could be granted when they'd have about 5,000 people. Then towns could elect their sheriff. The sheriff would be responsible for law enforcement in that local town, in that local area, in that local county. The sheriff would also be responsible for tax collection, and they would run and organise the county jail. The sheriff, of course, could also, at certain times, appoint deputy sheriffs, other sheriffs, and in time of real need, they could organise a posse, a group of local men. So basically what happens is the sheriff would be in need of help, in need of assistance, so he would go to the local men in the town and he'd say to them, please, quick, come on, give me a hand, give me a hand. Sorry, I apologise for that terrible joke. The thing is important though, the sheriff could ask other people for help, the posse, and then they would go and try and track down the criminals. So territories had sheriffs. A territory could become a state in the United States, but only if there were 60,000 people. Once it became a state, 60,000 people, the state would have its own legal system. But before then, before there were 60,000 people in the area, the federal government were involved, ladies and gentlemen. They would pass laws for the territory. They could appoint a governor, judges, often 3 judges, and the United States Marshal in charge of the sheriffs, above the sheriffs. And then the United States Marshal would have deputy marshals. So that's how the system worked, in theory. Now, sheriffs and marshals had a difficult job. I've hinted at some of the problems a little bit earlier in this video. Now, if you've ever seen any films, Western films, cowboy films, often the sheriff or the marshal is the hero, going against criminals and outlaws, sometimes on their own. They did a very dangerous job. Maybe they would be outnumbered by the bad people, the criminals. They did have to face violence. That's why quite often they would carry a weapon themselves. As Bob Marley sang, I shot the sheriff, but I didn't shoot his deputy. Violence and a risk of being shot was part of the job that faced the sheriffs and the marshals. Now, I've been talking about the job that they did. To try and help you remember, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a look at the problems, their jobs in 3D. Way, there it is in 3D. Now, what am I on about? Well, one way to remember the job of a sheriff or a marshal is there. The 3Ds: detect, deter, detain. There they are, ladies and gentlemen. The 3Ds: detect, deter, detain. These were the basic elements of a sheriff's job. Well, what do we mean? Detect, detection. I've already suggested they had a huge area to cover. Crime often happened many, many days or weeks before the sheriff would arrive. That presented a problem. It was hard to collect evidence due to the delay in getting there. A sheriff in Kansas, for example, which became a state, had 200,000 square kilometres to cover. That is impossible. You've got to remember, they didn't have radio contact. Later on they could send a telegram, but at first all they had was themselves, a horse and a gun. It was tricky. How could you possibly detect who has committed the crime when the crimes happened a long, long way away, many, many days before you arrive? It's difficult to do that job. Detection was difficult. Here's an example. One of the very, very common crimes back in the American West was cattle stealing, or to use the terminology that they used at that time, cattle rustling. It was very, very profitable because you stole somebody else's cattle. They've done all the hard work of rearing the cattle, feeding the cattle. You come along and steal the cattle and sell it. So it was a common crime. Cattle rustling was very, very, very severe problem in the American West because it was so profitable. But how can you prove who's doing it? That's the issue facing the sheriffs and the marshals. Cattle rustling, an example of one of the crimes that would be difficult to detect. Reminds me of that old joke, ladies and gentlemen, talking about cattle rustling. Remember what I said? Rustling was a crime. That's what they called it. Man walks into a bar in a town in the American West. And do you know what? He's wearing a paper hat, paper shirt and paper trousers. The sheriff arrives and arrests him for rustling. That's the last of the jokes in this video. You'll be pleased to hear that, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry about that. So, detection was difficult. But what about the second D? Deter, deterrent. What's that all about? Well, if you deter someone, it means you're stopping them from committing a crime because the criminal is afraid of getting caught. But it was hard to deter crime because often the people committing it knew that they had a very, very good chance of getting away with things because of the problems with detection, the fact that the area was so big, the fact that there were so few sheriffs. Can you see how it all links together, ladies and gentlemen? So if you think, oh, I need some money, I'm going to commit a crime, and there's a great chance I won't be caught, many, many people would think, I'll commit the crime. And even if they get tracked down by the sheriff, remember the sheriff might often be outnumbered by the criminals. So they think, well, that doesn't matter because I can fight my way out of it. The Clash, one of my favourite bands from the 1970s, had a great song. I fought the law and the law won. Well, in the American West, ladies and gentlemen, the law often didn't win for the reasons that I've just tried to suggest. So, acting as a deterrent to prevent crime in the first place was difficult in the early days until the system got more established. The second D, deter. And that leads us to the third one, detain. Let's say, for example, the sheriff had either got lucky or got some help and they'd managed to detect who the criminal was. So then they've got to go and arrest them and detain them. So the sheriff could put criminals in jail and wait for the marshal and the judge to arrive. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, remember the sheriff might often be outnumbered, particularly if the prisoner was a member of a gang. And then would the gang arrive and try to get the prisoner out? That would be a problem. Do you remember at the start of this video when I was talking about money? And I said some sheriffs weren't very well paid and they decided to take bribes. They became corrupt. Now, an example of that was a town in the state of Montana called Bannack, the town of Bannack. Now, in the town of Bannack, the sheriff was a man called Henry Plummer. But Bannack faced a big problem. There was a local gang of toughs, of criminals, 100 or more people committing crime. And the people, the law-abiding people in Bannack wanted this problem sorted out. So here's a problem for Henry Plummer. He's the sheriff. He's up against a gang of 100. What could he do? Well, he did very little. And do you know why? Was he afraid? No. People found out, ladies and gentlemen, that Henry Plummer, the Bannack sheriff, was also the leader of the criminal gang. So no wonder he did nothing. Wow, what a position to be in for those poor people in Bannock. In the end, in 1864, they all got together and Henry Plummer was hanged. A group of local vigilantes sorted the problem out. But that just shows how far the problem of law and order still had to go when the sheriff was the leader of a gang of criminals in the town of Bannock. So vigilantes would step in. Now in that case they got the right man and Henry Plummer was hanged. But sometimes vigilantes who weren't trained got the wrong person, and then that caused even more problems. So it wasn't a perfect answer. So there we have it. Law and order up to the 1860s was difficult to establish in the American West for reasons hopefully that I've tried to explain. Eventually things did improve. As we moved into the 1870s, 80s, 90s, things did get better, and we'll look at how that occurred in later videos. So there we have the end of the first section of the course. Next video, we'll start the second section, the development of the plains, 1862 to 1876. So that's coming soon. Till then, as ever, I hope it's been useful. All the best, and I shall see you soon. Bye now.